It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program producer emeritus of the Majority Report, full disclosure, and now with Russ Feingold's Progressive United. Josh, what is your position there?
Well, first, just to correct you, I'm actually executive producer emeritus.
That's right. Okay, sorry. Apologies.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Hold on.
We got rid of that. We got rid of that that title here. So.
Putting on my Eric Alterman hat for a second. Here I'm both the political and communications director at Progressives United.
So now, Josh, let's get into this. Yesterday in the better half of the program, I outlined what started this battle in many respects, and Elizabeth Warren's response. Before we get there, why don't you tell us who is the third way?
Well, Third Way is basically just a front group. They operate and file taxes as a think tank. They have policy staff, they have communications staff, they have outreach staff, but the product they produce is basically corporatist, centrist. They like to think that they're leaning a little left, but this is the group that will basically say the Democratic Party is not being responsible with money. They'll echo conservative attacks on liberals and say, Democrats need to get real with the budget. We need to look at cutting Social Security. We need to look at massive cuts in order to balance the budget. These guys put out a product that serves the people that fund it, and the people that fund it are, in large part, likely large corporations. You watch The Sopranos, right? So Tony Soprano didn't own the pork store for the sausages, right? And I think for the same reason, corporations aren't funding Third Way because they want to engage in some academic discussion of policy. They contribute to Third Way because they want their policies, their corporate policies, laundered in some way, buffed, and then put out as mainstream views.
And I should say, Li Fong did a piece the other day in The Nation magazine where he did some digging in the annual report for Third Way. The group relies on a consulting firm to raise $500,000 a year. Peck, Madigan, Jones, Stewart. It is a corporate lobbying firm that represents Deutsche Bank, Intel, the Business Roundtable, Amgen, AT&T, the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, one of my favorite, MasterCard, Pharma, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, among others. They're basically a lobbyist outfit that does fundraising for the Third Way. Humana lists its $25,000 donation to Third Way not as a donation to a think tank, but in its own budget as part of its yearly budget spent on lobbying activity. Now, a lot of this is rather opaque, so you have to sort of reverse engineer it. So they came out the other day with a Wall Street Journal, fittingly in the Wall Street Journal, opinion piece, attacking Elizabeth Warren, attacking the idea of expanding Social Security, attacking essentially Medicare and Social Security for that matter, and saying that this is a very bad route for Democrats to take from an electoral standpoint. And then Elizabeth Warren struck back. Tell us what she did.
Well, she wrote a letter to major Wall Street financial institutions, and they basically said, look, the law requires that you are transparent about your contributions to other types of organizations that do political work. But the law does not require transparency for corporate contributions to think tanks like Third Way. And she called on them to reveal their donations to think tanks to bring transparency. She said it's the right thing to do for your shareholders. It's the right thing to do for the people affected by this policy. She stood up for her values, but she took the high road doing it. And I think that that's really admirable, because even that, I got a call from a reporter just about 20 minutes ago who said, what do you think about those who are criticizing Elizabeth Warren for sort of like coming out, so aggressively and responding to third way like that? And I was like, one, there's a ridiculous double standard. Well, there's several double standards, but there's a ridiculous double standard in how hard progressives can fight back. It's like, they're sort of expected to be complacent, and Elizabeth Warren is bold and, says what she means, and she doesn't do that. And so I think, the criticism of her is ridiculous. And I think that if anything, she could have called out third way directly and said, these guys are a joke. And she didn't do that. And so some of the work that the PCCC and Democracy for America and Progressives United is doing is actually telling the story about third way, and then looking at their co-chairs, their honorary co-chairs, which include a lot of elected officials, like Alison Schwartz in Pennsylvania, who's running for governor, like James Clyburn, who's in the House leadership, or Jared Polis, and calling for them to denounce the op-ed from Third Way and to resign as an honorary co-chair.
And so I just want to step back before we get to that part and what's there. But the subtext of Elizabeth Warren's letter was, hey, let us know who you're funding.
The subtext of Elizabeth Warren's letter is, you guys aren't fooling anybody. We know what you're doing. We know what Third Way is doing. I don't even have to mention them. We know who's behind this. We know what their goal is. She was basically, to go back to the Sopranos metaphor, she was basically saying, that's not really a pork store, right? That's not, no one's getting fooled. We're all in on it, and it's about time we all stopped kidding ourselves.
Right. Just let's see a little transparency. Let's just be honest with where you're coming from. You want to lobby on behalf of Wall Street? Then just come out and say it, that we're a lobbying arm of Wall Street. And so, all right. So now the PCCC sent out, I think, literally like 3 or 4 mailers yesterday, calling on Schwartz, who is running in a primary in Pennsylvania, to disavow the group. The Third Way. And I know that you guys have called on Jared Polis, Representative Crowley, and Clyburn, like you said, in denouncing these attacks. What are the for people who look at this and just see like this is just like a little squabble? What difference does it make? What's going on here?
Well, I think there's 2 things. One is that Third Way has a constituency, and that constituency lives entirely in Washington, D.C. Half of their constituency probably writes for Politico. They have this, the way they've tried to position themselves, Third Way's tried to position themselves as the reasonable part of the Democratic Party. They're not the sort of spendy, welfare, irresponsible with money wing of the Democratic Party that thinks that we can all, retire on $1 million a year without paying for it. They consider themselves very serious people. And, and so they use these co-chairs basically as a way to legitimize themselves. And, what I think is funny, and my friend Adam Green said this yesterday, I saw him say, is that, they picked the worst possible fight to pick right now in the Democratic Party, because they went after 2 of the probably most, if not the most popular things in the Democratic Party, Elizabeth Warren and Social Security. And I would add to what Adam said is not only did they pick the most ridiculous fight, but they picked it at the most ridiculous time. You remember back in 2005 when George Bush was trying to privatize Social Security, and, the whole Democratic establishment did a fairly, some people had to be dragged kicking and screaming, but did a fairly good job pushing back and preserving and Social Security as the program it is. A few years ago, I think we were sort of we finally reached a point where it was toxic for Democrats in elected Democrats and candidates to say that they favored cutting Social Security, that even sort of adjustments like chain CPI, just in the last maybe the last year or 18 months, where Democrats realize that that's not going to fly. We shouldn't be balancing the budget on the back of our retiring working people. And now, just in the last 6 months or so, The idea of expanding Social Security benefits has become mainstream. You see folks, the stuff that the proposal that Tom Harkin's been pushing forever, Elizabeth Warren is in favor of actually expanding Social Security benefits and paying for it and more by lifting the FICA tax, right? The FICA limit. It makes total sense. So, in that progression, the third way probably lands somewhere in 2009, maybe 2008. But it's just like, their arguments are, no matter what, they come off as a relic of a different era almost.
And in some respects, I mean, the interesting thing here is that while this attack on Elizabeth Warren and the idea of expanding Social Security sort of was seen as offensive, in some ways, just the fact that they could not choose their timing at a very bad time for this, obviously, because this is picking up steam. And very well, I mean, I don't think, that it's implausible to see that this is going to be something of an electoral issue going forward. We're certainly going to see this, I think, with the minimum wage increase. But it's almost as if their timing was also incredibly defensive. Like they thought that this is the last chance that they're going to have to slow the momentum of this.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. And I think to anyone outside of that bubble, it's absurd. All the public polling shows overwhelming support for expanding Social Security, let alone the poll numbers on trying to cut Social Security. Although I do think that this episode has wound up being valuable, not only because it's sort of like, I don't know what metaphor to use, but you sort of feed, you sort of...
Well, how about Game of Thrones? I mean, you're doing the whole HBO lineup, it sounds like.
Yeah, no, I don't watch Game of Thrones. I couldn't get into it. But it's a good primer, right? It's like this is almost like batting practice for this kind of softball to come over the plate, where progressives can, it basically teed up a national platform for progressives all across the country to make the case for expansion of Social Security and almost sort of crystallize how popular this progressivism has become. And it was useful for one other reason, I think, is to see the reaction from the media inside D.C. You see Mike Allen from Political call this a game changer, and the people in D.C. in the press, or some of them anyway, still see Social Security expansion or just Social Security as a ridiculous program of excess that, look, to think that, anybody who doesn't want to cut it is not being fiscally responsible. There's no data behind what they're saying. There's no actual facts. For them, it's, you see the third way and their policies. I guess if third way has a genius, it's that they've taken the needs of corporations, the sort of raw, ridiculous, anti-worker policies that benefit corporations, and they've sort of they've given it this sort of cultural acceptability in D.C., where they talk about it as reasonable and responsible, and but it's really just corporate policy. They just made it seem palatable and responsible to D.C. insiders.
And that's what gets to why you go after the co-chairs, because they are lending that veneer of it being a legitimate sort of policy position as opposed to simply advocacy for Wall Street and corporations.
Of course, and the result will be, we hope, is that we're cleaving away not only the elected officials associated with Third Way, but anybody who's sort of paying attention to this stuff and maybe thought Third Way is sort of reasonable. We want to make it clear that Third Way is over there with the corporations. This is a pretty clear division here. And you're either going to be with working people and those, who all the millions and millions kept out of poverty by Social Security, or you're going to be with the corporations. And, these sort of clarifying moments let Mike Allen stand over there on the other side of the room with the corporations. And so that's useful, right? Because we say, okay, he's on that team. And everyone else, that's why we're asking Alison Schwartz and other elected officials say, are you going to be stand over there with them, or are you going to be with us? And I think I'm hoping they're going to be with us.
And this is very much part of a long game. I mean, we had to deal with the DLC for 15, 20 years, I guess it was. And they finally just sort of like evaporated and melted away. This isn't going to be something that's going to destroy the third way in the short run or even in the mid run. And, assuming or just saying like Alison Schwartz ends up being the governor of Pennsylvania, that doesn't necessarily mean that her policies are going to change. If she is the type of person that wants to be associated with these people, that doesn't necessarily mean that her policies are going to radically change. It's just slowly creating an environment where association with these policies is toxic, and it gives them less room to maneuver in this context.
Yeah, of course, and I think that you saw this kind of long game. It's not a perfect analogy, but you saw this sort of long game with Iraq, where as the reality of facts became more and more obvious, elected officials sort of had to look at these constant votes. That was the brilliance of the sort of escalating strategy of like, okay, there's a timetable, it's non-binding. There's a timetable that is binding with appropriation money. It's sort of like turning this one-way ratchet, right? That you once you go one way, you can't go back. And elected officials are going, I can't vote for that anymore, And I think that part of it is this association with third way, and the idea of cutting Social Security is like, we want elected officials who have their finger in the air to say, what, it doesn't help me to side with third way anymore, and. It's so. Just to go back to the timing thing one more time, look, I think that it's smart to always suspect the Democratic Party, or to at least make them prove that they're on our side. And I think that what makes this even more hilarious is that what was it, a month and a half ago the government shut down, where the conservative dream and the Paul Ryan dream, and he's still trying to play with it now, and he'll try and play with it at the beginning of the year, this notion of a grand bargain. And I don't think the whole strategy or the caucus is perfect, but the Democrats it's cutting Social Security now is a non-starter in the Senate. It's dead. That's dead. And this notion, and we saw the entire Senate caucus unified in shutting all Republicans' demands down, and I think that was a good marker because it sort of set a new marker. And just to say, well, no, we need to cut Social Security. It's like that those days are over. I don't fit into the clothes I fit in when I was 13 or 25, to be honest. I think that I can't be sure because obviously none of this funding is public, and so this is just pure speculation. And I could be 180 degrees incorrect, but there's part of me that suspects that Third Way may not be doing as well financially as they would hope, and that they need these sort of public displays of absurd centrism. And to go after Wall Street's biggest enemy in the Senate, Elizabeth Warren, to say, look, someone is standing up to her, finally, to try and sort of suck up to the big banks, to try and garner more support. That's the only thing I can imagine.
It's interesting because ALEC apparently is also having a tough time with fundraising, particularly after the Trayvon Martin and the whole Stand Your Ground fight. And so that's an interesting theory that despite the fact that this was very bad timing from a political strategy standpoint, they just had to do it because they need to show end of year, hey, it's Black Friday.
Well, exactly. And there's a couple other hints. One, as you mentioned, the placement in the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which Wall Street reads and which is ridiculously, obnoxiously conservative. The second was the substance of the piece, or I should say lack of substance. They sort of talked about how Social Security was not increasing Social Security was not fiscally responsible, and they sort of did. But if you sort of read it if you sort of step back, that their op-ed was really sort of almost more of a cultural attack on folks like Elizabeth Warren and Bill DeBlasio. Yes. Notice that they didn't go after.
Right. I mean, well, first off, that's the giveaway right there, right? I mean, because they did also attack Bill DeBlasio. Bill DeBlasio, whatever you think of him, has nothing to do with these questions. Nothing.
That's right.
Nothing. He's not involved in this at all in Washington.
Right. That's right. And not only that, but look, I know Elizabeth Warren is very visible and high profile, and she signed on to the proposal to expand Social Security. But they didn't mention Tom Harkin, who's retiring, whose proposal it is. They didn't mention any of the other senators who were, who originally wrote this proposal or co-sponsored the bill before Elizabeth Warren did. They went after the sort of cultural faces of this new populist progressivism.
Let's carry this even further. Let's carry this even further, okay? Because the bottom line is, the one thing I do know is that Bill DeBlasio lost big, as was expected, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where all the investment bankers are. And I was hearing from people who deal with these people all the time that they were terrified of Bill DeBlasio. So this was clearly aimed at a psychographic that is really their contributing base.
Absolutely, and the same sort of fear exists with Elizabeth Warren. If you talk to longtime Democratic fundraisers who really don't have any ideology at all, they have to, when they go to big bundlers who work on Wall Street or do investment banking, my guess is that oftentimes they're actually asked to explain how they're going to keep Elizabeth Warren in a box. It's sort of the same thing.
With that in mind, and this is not directly related, but, Chuck Schumer just had a big interview in the New Republic where he said a couple of things that I found to be, not terribly surprising from Chuck Schumer. The guy represents Wall Street, but that he's sort of breaking out and being a little bit more aggressive in making that clear. There were two things that jumped out at me in that interview. One was he said he basically equated left-wing blogs with the Tea Party. And two was he said, I went to Scott Brown and said, if you vote for us on the Disclose Act, we won't help any challenger to you, okay? And that challenger, of course, was Elizabeth Warren. And it's almost as if Chuck Schumer's saying to Wall Street, coincidentally, this is coming out at the same time Third Way is pushing this out, like, hey, guys, look, I did everything I could to keep Elizabeth Warren out of the race. And, I'm still trying to elect Democrats, but I just want you to know that my heart's in the right place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just indicative of what we were talking about earlier, that, this idea that what Elizabeth Warren represents is an end to the days of sort of progressive incrementalism, right? She's proudly, happily, very clearly working for progressive populist principles and ideas. And people have to choose whether they're on board with that or not. And so you see a lot of elected officials trying to sort of fuzz the line a little bit because they don't want to take a side.
Yeah, interesting stuff. And of course, we should also say that Elizabeth Warren yesterday, coincidentally, it was reported in the Herald, I guess, that she said explicitly, I am not going to run for president. I'm going to finish my term as a senator in Massachusetts. Yeah,
I mean, I was just asked about this too, and my answer was like, I don't really see any bad options. It's not like one of the options was retiring or moving to Guam or whatever. It was she's opted to stay in the Senate for the remainder of her term and be a huge pain in Wall Street's ass. Okay, I'm okay with that. I mean, I was asked, are you disappointed that she's not running for president? I was like, well, I mean, it's sort of an absurd question. It's like, yeah, I guess I'm disappointed that she's not going to be president in the same way that she is yet to be appointed exalted ruler of the universe. Of course, I'm disappointed in, I always want to see Elizabeth Warren with more power. If that's not going to happen in this election cycle, I'm pretty happy with her continuing the work she's doing in the Senate in the meantime.
Right, and we should say two things. One, if I remember correctly, at this point, I think Barack Obama said the same thing. A. And B, by saying this, by taking the presidential run off the table, it's basically like saying to her critics, this is a big F you, because that means I am here, I am in the Senate. I think no one with half a brain thinks that I couldn't take this seat another 6-year term. And so you're going to have to deal with me. You will have no leverage points with me. You will have no ability to go out and say, don't give her money for the campaign. Let's fight her now. That's it. This is what it is. You're going to have to deal with it.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I think it's so funny. Look, I take Elizabeth Warren at her word, right?
Right.
But I think it's so funny because
she didn't have to say this. Look, she didn't have to say it explicitly now. I mean, a lot of people sort of tease around on something like this, but by saying it so explicitly now, it's saying you have no leverage over me. You have no more leverage over me.
And not only that, but I think it's interesting because she totally jams the radar of these sort of political insiders who cover the presidential horse race, because they're so used to observing candidates sort of going through these very obvious mechanical contortions to position themselves to run for president, where it's like, I guess I didn't. Like John Edwards had his Iraq War baptism and sort of disavowed his vote, and it's like, I think the fact that she gets asked about it so much is an indication of how mainstream her policies have become. And B, she scrambles their radar because this is just the work she does. This is what she's always believed in. This is what she talked about when she was guest blogging for Josh Marshall 10 years ago, right? Like they don't understand. They don't get her. There's no handhold for them because they can't see her making these sort of ridiculous, obvious contortions to appease some presidential base. Like, this is just who she is, and she does what she believes in, and that's not something Mike Allen is used to covering.
Right, and we should say, so not only is there value in fighting back against the third way in this instance, but there's also value in making sure that progressives have her back in this instance and make people who attack her and try and weaken her position pay a price.
Yeah, it's great. We don't always get to do this, but Third Way sort of setting this up, and what the PCCC and DFA and Progressives United do. I think progressives should realize that we've got actually some open field to run here. This is a time to put some points on the board.
I love your metaphors. Sopranos. I believe that was a football metaphor, or soccer. I guess open field. Josh Orton from Progressives United. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time today, buddy.